Hello everybody. So this video is about the rise and decline of the Abbasid Caliphate, but it's not an extensive, detailed treatment of the history of the Abbasids. Not at all, but it's actually a brief description of the conditions that led to the decline of the Abbasids and then the emergence of these Central Asian steppe empires. So this short video is intended for as a primer for the Islamic history course that I'm teaching. And then my course starts with the emergence of the steppe peoples, the rise of the Turkic peoples. So before I can do this, I need to give you all an overview of the conditions that existed before the arrival of these Central Asian Turkic military dynasties, primarily the Seljuks. So I'm going to go back to the emergence of Islam, say a couple of things about the emergence of the Islamic civilization, politics, and then talk about the Umayyads, Abbasids, finally the strength and the weakness of the Abbasid Empire, Abbasid Caliphate, connecting all of these things to the development of the Central Asian military dynasties. Okay, let's begin. I'm going to be using my keynote for. So Islam begins with the Prophet Muhammad, who died in 632, who brought a revelation and a new scripture, a monotheistic religion that is similar to Christianity and Judaism, but actually is also different from these two religions, different enough to exist as an independent nation, independent community, independent religious community. So the message of Muhammad was revolutionary, egalitarian, and then transformative and very appealing, it looks like, from all the evidence that we have, to Arab peoples in Arabia as well as people outside of Arabia, right? So it is novel in Arabia, but we should also note that monotheism is not introduced by Islam, right? You have Christians, Jews, but small pockets of these communities in Arabia. But then the novel thing with Islam is the way it is able to erase pre-existing religiosities like polytheism, pre-existing cults and shrines and everything, and then replace them with a monotheistic faith that is the faith of the Arabs initially. Then it's going to be the faith of other peoples neighboring Arabia, right? So these kinds of revolutionary moments may have happened before Muhammad. Messianic movements may have existed before Muhammad in Arabia, but it looks like none of them succeeded, right? But what sets Muhammad and his mission apart is he was able to succeed, right? This is how we have Islam today as a significant independent religion. So the other success with triumph, really, with Muhammad's project, Muhammad's enterprise venture, is really the emergence of a new civilization, right? The Islamic civilization. So the Islamic civilization is an inheritor, but also remember maybe an eraser, replacer of so many classical civilizations of the Near East. So is inherits the culture, civilization of Semitic peoples, Egyptians, Kushite, Aksum kingdoms, Mesopotamian, and then Near Eastern, Persian cultures. It's a continuation. It's influenced by Roman, Greek-Roman cultures, Hellenistic cultures as well. But remember, it erases the influence of the Greek language and it replaces it with Arabic, right? So it's very remarkable. So this is the scene in Arabia. It's a geography. It's a land of tribes, pastoralists, camel pastoralists, nomadic people for the most part, polytheists for the most part, some very minor, small influence of Christianity and Judaism inside Arabia. In the south, there's strong presence of Christianity and Judaism. In the north as well, strong presence of Christianity in the north of the peninsula. In places today we call Syria and Iraq. But in the Arabian Peninsula proper, right, we don't really have a lot of monotheistic tradition. We don't really have a tradition of empire, tradition of government, law, any remarkable tradition there. So Islam replaces these things and unites the Arabian Peninsula and replaces them with a single identity of an Arab Muslim. Early successors to Muhammad, known as the Rashidun caliphs. The first four caliphs are known as the Rashidun caliphs. It's a term that is loaded with sectarian perspectives in Islam. Rashidun means the rightly guided from a certain perspective. From which perspective? Primarily Sunni perspective. From a Shia perspective, at least three of these four leaders, four caliphs, they were not rightly guided, right? So this is something we can talk about later, right? So this is about the split, the conflict between Sunni and Shia Islam. But then what I'm trying to say here is this roughly 30-year period of the first four caliphs witnesses a large expansion of Islam through conquest. We call this the Arab conquests, Islamic conquests, right? What begins under these first four caliphs continue under their successors. The dynasty right now, the hereditary dynasty of the Umayyads. The name Umayyad derives from the name of a clan from Arabia, from the tribe of Quraysh, the same tribe that Muhammad was part of, right? But not the same clans, not the same house. So the Umayyads established a dynasty, a hereditary dynasty, which lasts about a century, from roughly 661 to 750. And then they're centered in Syria, in the city of Damascus. It's a conquest empire, very successful at that. But it's not a time of harmonious, peaceful coexistence of Muslims and others, Arabs and others. There's some conflict. And even among Muslims, there's lots of conflict. There's one particular term we use when we talk about these conflicts within Islam. The word is fitna, right? Fitna means a dispute, a quarrel within a community, but also a civil war in this sense, right? Muslims go through a number of civil wars, and the major reason for these civil wars under the Umayyads is really succession, leadership. Who's going to succeed Muhammad? Who's going to replace Muhammad? Who's going to lead the community in the absence of Muhammad? What kind of a person? What are the qualities of the person who's going to lead Muslims, right? Muslims go to war, really, civil wars, at least three of them, very bloody ones at that, over the question of leadership and succession to Muhammad. Something, again, a very, very important subject. Hopefully I'm going to be, I'll have another video on this one. And Umayyads themselves were overthrown by another dynasty called the Abbasid dynasty, the Abbasid caliphs. They also call themselves caliphs. Maybe as a quick footnote, the word caliph is an Arabic term from the Arabic word khalifa, meaning deputy, successor, someone who takes care of the duties, the work of somebody on his behalf, right? So Muslims early on, the first caliph called himself caliph, right? Caliph of Muhammad, right? The successor to Muhammad, the deputy of Muhammad. And then the other caliph, the succeeding caliph, Umar, also called himself a caliph. He interestingly said, I'm the caliph of the previous caliph. I'm a successor to the previous successor to Muhammad, right? But then at some point, they dropped this successor to successor to successor, terminology, just replace it with caliph. Or another term, Emir al-Mu'mineen, meaning the commander or the prince of the believers, of the faithful, right? Emir al-Mu'mineen or caliph becomes the major term these people use for themselves, the leaders of the Islamic world. Abbasids are another dynasty overthrowing the Umayyads. Important thing to note here is the rise of the Abbasid revolution. It's a war, it's a rebellion. Starts in Eastern Islamic world, somewhere we call Khorasan, right? To the east of the Islamic world, roughly Eastern Iran, Western Afghanistan, those regions, number one. So revolution starts from the east, number one. And number two, when the revolution succeeds, when the Abbasids take over, they eliminate the Umayyads, they move the center of the power, political power, the seat of the caliphate from Damascus, Syria, to Baghdad. Actually, they found the city of Baghdad, right? So an important shift is taking place here. The center of gravity is moving from Syria, a Byzantine, former Byzantine territory, a territory where you have lots of Christian and Hellenistic influence, to Baghdad in the center of Mesopotamia, where you have a significant influence of Persianate Near Eastern traditions. So the history of the Abbasid Caliphate will also reflect this major change. Again, something hopefully we can get into in a bit more detail sometime later, but not in this video. So I'm moving on. The Abbasid Caliphate initially is very successful in establishing a brilliant civilization, very rich at the center of the trade networks of the time, from the Silk Road to Indian Ocean, the spice trade, very successful. And it looks like, for the most part, peaceful, relatively speaking. And then they are sponsoring lots of creative, cultural, scientific activity. One very important example is the House of Wisdom in the city of Baghdad, the Abbasid caliphs established, which was an institution where you had many translators from languages of the region who translated these works into Arabic, meaning Arabs are now truly the inheritors of these classical civilizations, the knowledge of the classical world. Again, a very important subject. Hopefully we can deal with later. But then an important thing to keep in mind from this is, from certain perspectives, this period of the Abbasids is a golden age, a golden era, right? Wealth, prosperity, cultural and economic brilliance, scientific advancements, brilliant scholars, and not all these scholars are Arabs or Muslims. So you have a period ushered by these events, right, of number one, coexistence between various religious communities, and then number two, cultural and scientific brilliance, very important aspects of the Abbasid so-called Renaissance. An important thing to note about the Abbasid dynasty is early on in the first couple centuries. It's a long-lasting dynasty. So starting from 750 until the destruction during Mongol invasions in 1258, right? Roughly 5 centuries. But then in the first couple of centuries of the Abbasid rule, we have the emergence of these major sects of Islam, the crystallization, the final formation of these ideas of Sunni Islam versus Shi'i Islam, right? So again, a very, very important subject that needs its own lecture. But very quickly, the Sunni-Shi'i split is primarily a political and social split between two ideas in early Islam on the question of who is going to lead Muslim community. Do we care about who leads us? What are the qualifications of the person that leads Muslims, right? Is this an important matter? For some people, it's an important matter. It's important to go over war for. For some Muslims, it's not that important. Some Muslims want to avoid war, want to avoid conflict, internal conflict. The word fitna, again, should be remembered here. They want to avoid this. So, should be a Muslim, but then should the leader be a very wise person, very pious Muslim, a scholar, erudite, moral? That's not very important. As long as the leader provides for Muslims defense, religious freedoms, that's enough. So this is the idea of Sunni Islam, right? Sunni Muslims. But for Shia Muslims, no, there are certain things that are required of the leader of the Muslim world. Number one, the leader needs to come from a line of from the line of Muhammad. So Muhammad doesn't leave behind a son who survives him, but he leaves behind a son-in-law. So through the son-in-law, Ali, right? Descendants of Ali, they are the deserved, they are the legitimate leaders of Muslims. Anyone else who happens to be the leader, including pretty much most leaders that we have in this period, the Umayyad leaders, Abbasid leaders, all these caliphs, they are illegitimate. They are usurpers of power. Anyhow, So this is something we need to get into in much more detail, hopefully in another video. Okay, so moving on from the brilliant era of the Abbasids to other issues, for example, of conquest, massive conquest, right? Scholars call Islamic civilization the first truly global civilization. And I agree with this. Why? Very early on, in the first century of Islam, we see Muslims neighboring Spain, France, modern day, right? Neighboring the Sahara, the Atlantic Ocean, and the neighboring communities of Central Asia, the Chinese, and then India, right? Very quickly. I'm going to show maps in a second. So Muslims very quickly are in contact, in communication, conversation with European peoples of the Greek and Roman world, of Christianity, of Judaism, of African world, of Indian world, Indian Ocean, and then Central Asia and Eastern Asia, etc. Learn gunpowder, learn about gunpowder, learn about paper making, learn about planting oranges, to so on and so forth, and then bring them to other places, and then Islamic world becomes a bridge between east of the hemisphere, right, and the western end of the hemisphere, or ecumeny, right? This is the Afro-Eurasian oikumeny. Conversion to Islam doesn't come immediately. It takes place over centuries. For some places, several centuries, right? For Iran, we think, for example, Iran, Persia, which becomes part of the Islamic world roughly around 650, right? The whole Iran. But conversion takes place until the middle of the 10th century, perhaps 3 centuries. Why? There's a number of reasons. Number one, Islam doesn't have an imperative to convert. Not at all. There's actually a contrary idea to forced conversion in the Quran, and then Muslims obeyed this. So there is very much history of conquest in Islamic history, but there is very little history of forced conversion, very little. So this is really probably exceptional. And number two, the idea that these first peoples Muslims came into contact with, Jews and Christians of the Near East, they were seen by Muslims as peoples of the book, and the book meaning scripture, revelation. So in a general sense, it's the same scripture, same revelation, same divine message from God to these prophets, messengers, and etc. So Muslims respected these people, and then they, for the most part, let them be. There are some restrictions, but relatively speaking, for the time, Muslim treatment of non-Muslims were much better than comparable situations, right? So there were limitations, restrictions, and then discrimination, certainly, if you compare it to our modern understanding of religious freedoms, of course. But for its time, Muslims were much more tolerant towards others, non-Muslims. So they didn't request conversion. For the most part, they respected or let these communities be. There was another aspect of this as well that prevented Muslim leaders from hoping for conversion. That's very interesting. Not only that Muslim religion did not have an idea of a mission, an institution of missionary, but also there's this thing called jizya. I didn't have this in my slides here. Jizya meaning the tax that non-Muslims need to pay. So the jizya tax Muslims are not paying. Well, there's another tax that Muslims are paying and non-Muslims are not paying called zakat, and it's part of Islamic worship, right? Muslims have to pay a certain tax. So these are comparable. But again, jizya was more onerous. Jizya was more burdensome compared to zakat. So for some people, it may have been an incentive in conversion, but from the government's point of view, the fact that if people converted to Islam en masse, the government, the treasury, would be deprived of the jizya income, a very important cash tax, right? I mean, and not a tax, not in kind, but people have to pay in coins. It was a major problem, major concern for Muslim rulers. So there was no expectation on the side of these Muslim rulers for the people to convert, for the subject non-Muslim people to convert. Okay, so these are again things I can't go talk about in detail, but then for the most part we see under the Abbasids various traditions of Islam taking its final shape, including, for example, Sharia, including, for example, the study of Islamic law, the study of the prophetic traditions, hadith, right? The emergence of these canonical books under the canonical books of hadith, right? Kutub Sitta, the 6 canonical books, collections of hadith, the Prophet's sayings, traditions, but also the crystallization of the mystical tradition of Islam, the mystical dimension of Islam, in the words of Anne Mary late professor of Islam. Sufism, right? Tasawwuf in Islamic languages. So it emerges simultaneously in Iraq, modern day Iraq, in Egypt, and in eastern Iran, and then fused into this one major large tradition of Tasawwuf in the 10th and 11th centuries. Okay, moving on. So I talked about the good, the development, the bright aspects of life under the Abbasids. Obviously, I'm speaking about the decline. The question of decline is a very controversial thing in historical studies. But then in this one, I would like to use the term decline because there's clearly a decline in political authority, a decline in economic prosperity of the Abbasids, right? And decline in the power of the central administration, the rise of local dynasties, provincial dynasties, and then the fact that Abbasids are losing important territory to their rivals like the Fatimids, who are Shi'is, who start from North Africa, Tunis, and then capture Egypt, capture Syria, capture the Hijaz, the holy lands of Islam, Mecca and Medina. And then the problem with the Fatimids is, again, they are not only a rival caliphate, but they are also a rival religious ideology. They belong to Shia Islam. The Buyids, an Iranian dynasty, also Shia, right, take over the city of Baghdad and then become overlords of the Abbasids, a major problem which is known in historical studies of Islam as the Shia century, which lasted roughly from 950 to 1050, and which is a period of Shia dynasties controlling Sunni majority populations in Islamic world. We call it a Shia century because it looks like, at this point, it looks like an exception to the rule being Sunni leadership of Muslim populations, right? So regional dynasties under Persian, influenced by Persian identity, and then later Turkish identity, are going to pose major threats to the longevity of the Abbasid caliphal system, right? So this is a nice map showing in the central and eastern lands of Islam, or the Abbasid Caliphate, how the Abbasids are losing control over territories, provinces like Egypt, and then like Iranian, Persian territories and Central Asia, to local dynasties, right? So this has to do also with a decline in the quality of leadership, in the ability of Abbasid leadership, right, to exert political authority. But still, nobody is overthrowing the Abbasids at this point, right? Year 950, year 1000, still Abbasid dynasty continues uninterrupted. And when you get to year 1000, the Abbasid center itself, Baghdad, is occupied, controlled by Shia Buyid dynasty, as you see on this map, the Buyids, and northwestern Iranian dynasty, who are Shi'is. They captured the city of Baghdad, and then they enforce their power. They rule over the Abbasid Caliph, but again, they are not removing the Abbasid Caliph. So this is a period you have lots of Shia dynasties controlling very important centers of Islamic world. That's why we call the period Shia century. How does the Shia century end? The Shia century ends around 1050. If we want to be more specific, maybe in 1055, with the Seljuks, a Central Asian dynasty, a tribe, right? The Seljuks from Central Asia, northern Aral Sea, northern Transoxania, maybe today's Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, somewhere here. They emerge. They first join Middle Eastern politics as clients, as mercenaries of the Ghaznavids, another Turkic dynasty, right? Centered in Afghanistan in the city of Ghazna. But then later on, assert their independence, establish their own dynasty under two brothers, Tughril and Chagre, and then especially enjoying their the peak of their power under the successors of these two, Arslan first and then Malik Shah, and capturing the city of Baghdad, ousting the Shi'ites, re-establishing the supremacy of Sunni Islam in these lands at least, and then waging a war against the Shi'i Fatimids with the goal of capturing Cairo. But of course they cannot do this because they are interrupted by other events, other forces. This is something we need to get to later. But then, so this is how we get to the great Seljuks, the Seljuk Empire, initially as mercenaries, and then maybe as successors of these slave troops, Mamluks, right? But then, at this point, as rulers, maybe overlords of the Abbasids, they will establish a political system, a new political system, where you have the Caliph on the one side and the Sultan on the other side, two leaders of the Islamic world, and then Caliph representing religious and symbolic authority. When I say religious, I don't mean ability to interpret religion, but again, the idea that the caliphs are sitting on the seat of Muhammad as his successors. On the one hand, you have the caliphs, and on the other hand, you have the sultan. The word sultan comes from sultan, which is a Quranic term, which means authority, power, right? In this case, it means somebody who holds military, political power, right? So now you have a division of powers, a separation of powers, military, perhaps secular power, and then there's going to be religious, symbolic authority in the hands of the Abbasid caliphs, and then they are working together. We'll talk about these in more detail, in greater detail, and how this relationship works, and what are the implications of this interesting balance, separation of powers, legal implications, political implications, hopefully in another video. So I'd like to stop here. So we start with the emergence of Islam, the rise of religion, Islamic religion, and then the emergence of Islamic civilization as an inheritor, maybe eraser of certain classical civilizations, and then how Islamic society becomes a global society as a result of expansion, conquest, and then there's some degree of conversion, but slow, certainly a slow pace of conversion. Finally, after a period of strength and brilliance, we see a period of decline, a continuous decline of the Abbasid caliphal system, filling the vacuum of power a number of important forces like the Buyids, like the Fatimids, but finally deciding the matter would be the invasion of Middle East by these Turkic horse nomads, right? And then we're going to continue from here. I would like to stop now and then hope to be in touch with you. I'll continue with another lecture. Thanks for listening, and bye.